are live streaming as all of the young people apparently do nowadays, and I'm just coming around to it. So if you're seeing us on YouTube or on Facebook or wherever it might be, welcome. This is a special occasion as we are sitting here at about 1 p.m. on the East Coast in the United States. What is that, like 6 o'clock in the UK, I believe? And lots to talk about. Normally, I just kind of monologue my way through all of this and touch on all of the key issues that I want to highlight and so forth. But today, I have a very special guest with me, a longtime comrade and friend of mine. Sukant Chandan is with me. Say hi, Sukant.
Hello, listeners, viewers. Good to be here with my long-standing comrade Eric Drakester. Come to chat some more lyrics. Let's see where we go.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to discuss, of course. Now, Sukant, you and I have been chatting pretty regularly about everything that's going on vis-a-vis Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine, the situation of the war, the global situation politically, how the war in Ukraine has impacted all of these things. So, you know, I kind of don't even know where to begin in terms of what do we want to talk about today. We have something like an hour or so. So I guess maybe if you want, we can begin with the most recent news from the battlefield, or the most recent significant news from the battlefield, the news about a successful strike by the Ukrainian military on a Russian base that housed something akin to somewhere between 100 and 400 or 500 soldiers, and the reports are that the strike killed upwards of 85, if you want to take the Russian Ministry of Defense's estimate, to something like 400, if you believe the Ukrainian reports. So this is a major incident. So I guess we could just begin there. Sukant, I know you've been talking a little bit about not so much what happened. We're not military strategists, and we're not on the phone with Russian or Ukrainian generals, but the broader implications of this. What do we take from this incident? What's your read?
Number of things. I mean, it's to be really tragic and sad situation. In all honesty, these. So what? The Moscow leadership has recruited some 250,000 conscripts into its armed forces for its supremacist war of bombing, invasion, occupation, annexation. I mean, annexation. When was the last time state annexed another state? I think probably have to go back to maybe Saddam Hussein's Iraq, trying to attempt to annex Kuwait, which was a whole nother kettle of fish, as they say. But anyway, so 250,000 conscripts. There's many reports saying that that's actually just the beginning, and they want to go up to 1 million. And actually, after this attack, there are reports that the Russian leadership want to recruit a lot more conscripts for another big human wave into Russia. And it's sad because it's the most exploited and vulnerable and oppressed people of Russia who are having to bear the brunt of this conscription and then being thrown into an arena, a theater of war with little to no training, little to no war material as it is in terms of even clothing and personal items. I mean, I say that with some sympathy, and then with a lack of sympathy, because you're allowing yourself to be thrown into a war which is seeing looting and rape and injury and torture and bombing and death and occupation and annexation. So that's where it becomes something that it's difficult to sympathize with those conscripts, because they're engaged in something that has no moral high ground whatsoever. And when a state has no moral high ground in conducting these type of, these death-inducing operations, then I don't have much sympathy when they see that demoralization. But back to the issue. So little training, thrown into a war, coming often from the periphery, Chechens, Dagestanis, prisoners, etc. Obviously, it's been grossly mismanaged, because throughout the whole year, since February 2022, since the onset of this, very soon after that, when they thought they could capture Kiev and it would be all over in days and weeks, then the recriminations start on Russian panels and Russian TV shows with leading spokesperson, talking heads, media personalities, all basically arguing in an ultra nationalist, or right-wing or far-right nationalist trajectory, that it's not good enough. We're not fighting the war good enough. We've got to fight the war harder. And some crazy comments coming out in those conversations, just totally wacko stuff that it's just sad to see where things have gone, but I suppose it inevitable in a lot of ways in terms of the trajectory that the Putin leadership has been dragging Russia into. So
Let's
yes,
talk about that, Sukant. Since we are limited on time, let's talk about what direction has Putin's leadership been dragging Russia into. I mean, this is one of the issues that, and I've highlighted this, you've highlighted this, many others have, that those elements on the left that continue to uphold Putin's left flank, even though they claim that they do not, they studiously ignore pretty much everything that Putin has said about this war, most of the justifications that he made at the beginning of the war, the direction that Russia has gone, both in terms of the laws that have been put in place to clamp down on dissent, the attacks on anti-war protesters, leftists inside of Russia. God forbid you're a Marxist or an anarchist, you might be in prison right now. So can we talk a little bit about what you just mentioned, the trajectory that Putin has taken Russia, and simultaneously the trajectory that some elements on the left have taken vis-a-vis Russia?
So this is a 20+ year story, so there's only so much we can kind of explore and discuss. But in a nutshell, Putin postured as the savior for the Russian masses from the Yeltsin period. Okay, so
Yes.
he then the thing is, during the Yeltsin decade, post-Soviet Yeltsin decade, right, which was, a lot of Western imperialist machinations going on there.
I lived there. I know. I watched it. My dad was involved in it. I know.
Right. So yeah, and that's why your voice is actually quite important in this regards in relation to Russia and your heritage in Ukraine and you being of Jewish heritage as well. All of this is quite important. Anyway, so you have this Yeltsin decade, the drunk, right, allowed Western looting of Russian, labor and wealth, basically, and mineral wealth. Putin comes, the big savior, slap the oligarchs. Remember the famous thing? He goes to the managers in the factory. Oh, tell you off. Okay, he's the savior. Why is he the savior? Saving what? Russian masses are like, look, that Soviet period wasn't too bad. Nostalgia rises up. Guaranteed basic healthcare, holidays, cultural access. Not bad compared to all of this looting. Putin comes, and with Alexander Dugin, very interesting, both of these operators, Dugin forms the National Bolsheviks, a neo-Nazi movement, Russian ultra-nationalist, far-right nationalist movement, National Bolshevik, right? Remember Hitler's, what was it? Jewish Bolshevik, right? A remix in the Duginist frame of that. Also pro-Putin. Putin uses the Soviet nostalgia, but fuses it into, doesn't fuse it with, he fuses it into this new Russian nationalism. Forgive me for using these words, but very trashy type of nationalism, sleazy, sexist, homophobic, racist, oligarchical, and, hold on a second, Putin, the posture against NATO, embedded with NATO, directly assisting the NATO occupation from Russian territory in Afghanistan. Actually, this is a little hilarious.
Convenient how they forget that Russia hosted a NATO base for 20 years.
January 2022, days before the Ukraine operation, Russia was supposed to have a joint NATO drill in Sweden, right? So all of this kind of red-brown, leftist supporting Putin or whatever, like trying to make out some kind of anti-NATO force. Well, here we go. Putin makes a speech. I'm doing an anti-communist operation in Ukraine. It's all that naughty boy Lenin's fault. It's all the Bolsheviks' fault, and this crazy concept of the right of nations to self-determination, right? The Bolsheviks and Lenin actually tried to resolve the issues of Russian empire, chauvinism, in a just way that's people-centered. Putin is totally counter-oppositional to that. And then there's lots of things here. Look, Putin represents a right-wing nationalist oligarchical state which abuses Soviet nostalgia to then try and take the pensioners' pensions. Just a few years ago in 2019,
yes.
Then he raises the pension age. Against who? Against the very demographic he's centrally trying to manipulate with his false posture on Soviet nostalgia. The Russian pensioners, the old people. This is what it is. And then here we go, dizzy with success with Crimea, East Ukraine, and then the Syria horror story. where Putin formally arranges bombing campaigns with Western imperialist states on Syria. That's the reality of what happened. Turns a blind eye at the very least as the constant Israeli military raids against Damascus nearly every week for a decade, right?
In collaboration with Israel.
Absolutely, this was open
Coordination and collaboration with Israel.
Absolutely. So he's dizzy with success. He's constructed with Dugin this global media industry, which has successfully drawn considerable, swathes of different public in different countries accessing news media. So Putin thinks, hey, I got the Chinese on my side. Things are going well for me. The West look really weak. It's a big strategic blunder there. The West look really weak. The West are falling apart. Okay, maybe you and I could also make that, now we know, wrong analysis. At the time, we could say a year ago, yeah, the West are weak, they're falling apart. So he tries it with Ukraine. What happens within weeks? Oh, the West is not that united, actually. NATO rallies together, emboldens NATO totally, and a total Western consensus against Russia.
Well, this is the interesting thing that I think is worth noting here, is that the very concept that Putin is quote unquote fighting a war against NATO is interesting in and of itself, because if we were to accept that framing as true, then Putin is getting absolutely smashed by NATO. NATO's troop presence in Europe has increased tenfold since he invaded Ukraine. NATO has gained new members in Sweden and Finland. NATO is re-energized after 20 years of being dragged through the mud in Afghanistan, the debacle of NATO's participation in Iraq, and all of these Libya, for Christ's sake, all of these other conflicts that NATO was involved in, where it became clear that it was never about European security, that it was about being the international arm of the U.S. military, or the European appendage of the U.S. military, or however you want to call it. All of this was very, very clear, and it's been clear for years and years and years to a lot of us, and quite literally overnight, Putin he infuses into NATO a mission, a cause, a justification, a legitimacy. If Putin is fighting a war against NATO, then he's NATO's best friend.
Well, that's clear, isn't it? And I'm sure you agree, but there's no celebration of reporting the facts that NATO is rallying and NATO is not.
No, it's a nightmare.
NATO, it's the military alliance of the most oppressive imperialist, the most traumatizing, kind of like states in the world. I mean, we've seen what's happened with Libya in 2011, which, by the way, NATO were falling apart in the Libya theater of war. The military and political leadership of France, Britain, US were all openly bickering with each other, and there arguably was an opening. But and this is where I think this is where we always say from our politics, right, that politics is always in the lead, not geopolitics.
Correct.
Politics is always in front. It's always in the lead. And politics dictates everything. And so I think, how can you really construct a cohesive, functional global project against NATO when actually you're espousing what, in the classic, sense of like a Marxist understanding or a radical socialist understanding, what Lenin or Mao would call a narrow nationalist approach. I mean, at best, this is very diplomatic language in relation to what's actually going on. It is a very narrow nationalist. Again, quoting Lenin, Lenin's very important in all of this, to go return back to Lenin, return back to Lenin, return back to Lenin. The Russian chauvinism. Can you really export your project globally on a position of Russian chauvinism and Russian empire revanchism? No, you can't. You just can't do it. And the Chinese are learning that with their Belt Road Initiative, which is another very strange kind of, perhaps some people call it Kautskyite approach. Like, how can you, as a Chinese state, think you can basically, build this economic infrastructure across the world and not address the very real realities of the nature of political states, and address them in some way, some way, means or shape? So the Central Asian people, the entire Central Asian people, despise China. Even the people closest to the Chinese leadership in the media except this is a reality. But they don't explain why. They don't deconstruct that and try and construct something, analysis that's sensible. And also the Central Asian masses are really upset and pissed off with Putin, not least because Putin sent in the Russian army to crush a Kazakh working class uprising, which was probably the most important working class uprising along with Sri Lanka in the whole year of 2022. How are you going to win friends like that? Where's the Hearts and Minds campaign on an ethical basis? There isn't one. It's indulging in the worst type of politics.
Well, I think also it's important to keep talking about what happened in Kazakhstan because it gets completely lost because 6 weeks later Putin invades Ukraine, and it gets forgotten. But as you know, as you stated, in January of 2022, Putin sent the Russian military into Kazakhstan to prop up the Nazarbayev, but the hangers-on around Nazarbayev, who have been there for decades, to prop up this sort of reactionary, kind of kleptocratic post-Soviet government, and more or less make it into yet another kind of adjunct of Russian power. And by crushing that, and it was a worker uprising, because we need to be clear, this was not some, the people in the capital who are driving nice cars and are living decently protesting for some bourgeois reform or something. These were oil workers, people at the lowest end of the socioeconomic ladder, people who are really struggling day to day, month to month, and they were out protesting things like fuel subsidies and other very basic economic demands, and were absolutely crushed by the Russian military, which, by the way, gets back to the other issue you just pointed out about imperial revanchism. Russian imperialism, which I know many people don't even want to pretend it never existed. Once you ask yourself how the people of Moscow ended up being on the Pacific Ocean, you think no human beings lived there? You think the Russians didn't colonize? You think the Russians didn't push further and further and further east and massacre and do all of the things that colonizers do, that the French did in Africa, the British did all over the world, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, the point is, I say all of that because imperial revanchism is important in understanding the ideological framework within which Putin is operating. It is not really so much about Kazakhstan. It is about demonstrating, at least it was, about demonstrating to certain players in the former Soviet space and elsewhere around the world that Russia can be counted on as the strong man, as to bring the muscle. When you and your government needs the muscle, Russia will be there. And when they did that, quite successfully in Kazakhstan, crushing that workers' uprising was yet another example of the Russians getting drunk on their own propaganda, thinking they could do to Ukraine whatever they wanted, just like they had done in Kazakhstan and Crimea and, in 2014 and so forth.
I think so. Let's go back to the root. I think it's really important when we understand any state that you understand the history of white supremacy and empire in that state. And this has knocked me in the head to say, like, Sukant, like, you got to do the serious research now. What is Russia? Where does it come from? As to your point, how did it start in Kiev, Rus, and ended up in the Pacific Ocean? What's going on there? Similarly with China as well. You need to understand the history of white supremacy in China. There's actually one particular book by an academic in the USA who's written some really good stuff on that as well, which is, there's no particular surprise, in terms of whiteness, white supremacy, how that fits into how these states see the world, and the othering, and putting people into zones of non-being, to quote Frantz Fanon. All of this is in play with Russia. And when it comes to the imperialism of Russia, what's Russia doing bombing Syria? What's Russia doing collaborating Western imperialism with Syria, collaborating with Erdogan? Yes, there's some tensions. Yes, there's some antagonisms, but there's also a lot of coordination. What's Russia doing, as you mentioned, putting its army into Kazakhstan? What's it protecting in Kazakhstan? Chinese investment, Russian investment there, export of capital, finance capital. It's all there.
Burkina Faso, Mali, Central African Republic, Mozambique. Yeah.
Go to the African context, right? What's all these constant reports? Wagner receiving funds from mines, mineral wealth of the African mass. Listen. I'm not going to rant. I'm not going to bullshit. The masses of Burkina Faso and the masses of Mali are not benefiting from switching from the French to the Russians. They're just not, And then this is where geopolitics, a narrow geopolitical view just does not give any answers, and actually it pulls you away from reality totally and distorts it in the interest of people who want to steal the mineral wealth and the labor of African people. This is ridiculous stuff. This is ridiculous stuff. And I think a lot of politics, there is no left and right, red brownism, fascist collaboration, fascist infiltration, all of this is influencing things. And there is a reaction, there's a healthy leftist reaction, radical leftist counter reaction to that. But all of this has dragged people to lose sight of what's going on with the masses, the laboring masses, the workers and peasants and students and officer class in the armed forces. Are they benefiting, particularly the laboring masses, for the entry of Wagner into Central African Republic, Sudan, Mali, Libya, etc.? No, they're not. They are still suffering the same stuff. So it's not an answer. Listen, if you want to big up Thomas Sankara, which people should, right, then apply it to Burkina Faso. What's Sankara going to say about all this rubbish going on? Sankara was like, if you want to see imperialism, look at your plate. If your food in your plate is as a result of imperialist global production, we're not winning. We need to become self-sufficient, rely on ourselves in the interest of the workers and peasants. Are the junta in Burkina Faso and Mali saying any of this? No, come on, let's not be silly now. No?
Well, and there is a certain segment of the left that thinks that any mention of Russia's activities in Africa or elsewhere is tantamount to basically denying that the CIA or the United States or the British or the French or whatever are doing many of these same things. And the very simple answer is no, it isn't. It's simply speaking to what is the reality on the African continent, where the Russians have entered into the traditional domain of the colonial powers, France, Britain, the United States, etc. In other words, scrambling for Africa is not exactly something that people on the left should ever find themselves justifying.
I agree. I mean, of course, China, Russia has no history of colonization like, the European powers do for at least 500 years. In Africa, that has to be stated. But then,
Of course.
why enter into the same framework that the imperialists have set up across the globe anyway? Russia and China are not challenging that. Yes, there's a multipolarity emerging. Absolutely, there clearly is. Chinese state has its own interest that it's trying to push. But what is the nature of this multipolarity? Another pole of extractive, capitalist, colonial looting? Oh, great, thank you. That's exactly what we need right now with environmental degradation and with the ongoing cost of living crisis, where people can't feed their children, pay their bills. In some cases, they don't even have electricity at all. 12-hour blackouts, 24-hour blackouts. Sri Lankan people running out of medicine. Look, Sri Lankan people hate China. It's not. I don't say this with any jubilation. I'm not bringing sweets as I say this. Some sweets, some other issues, but not on this. I want a multipolarity that actually benefits us. But if we haven't got a leadership like the quote unquote pink tide of Latin America, then which is not going to happen in Africa or Asia anytime soon. So we can't even advocate, as perhaps Lula has done and Chavez and Maduro have done, and Bolivia and Cuba, with Russia and China, say, okay, in a non-aligned strategy, what can you offer us, right? Because Lula broke down in tears when he mentioned in his inaugural presidential speech just the day before yesterday, when mentioning children and people begging in the streets. He has his heart and his loyalty to the laboring masses of Brazil, and he helped to uplift 40 million Brazilians out of abject poverty and into relative like lower middle class. I mean, that was a major achievement in the 2000s by him. So the point is that China and Russia are not replacing the Western global infrastructure of exploitation and looting. They want to join in, have a piece of the pie for themselves, in order to do what? Invade Kazakhstan, bomb Syria, and bomb Ukraine and annex Ukraine. In China's context, what are they doing to win hearts and minds across the world? They're not. They're doing a lot to actually make people think, well, actually, China is not offering alternative that's to the benefit of us. So get the hell out.
So let me switch gears a little bit and talk about Ukraine for a minute, because I think that one aspect of the war in Ukraine, and I'm speaking with regard to the discourse on the left. Obviously, if we were engaging with right-wing bloggers and the right-wing ecosystem online, it might be a little bit different. But on the left, which is what, where we reside and what we know. On the left, there is an entire contingent of folks who not only are they essentially advocating a position that Ukraine's struggle is not a war for national liberation or national resistance, but rather simply a proxy war for the United States. That there is no national liberation character here, that it's not something that should be supported. And a subsection of the left goes even further to align with Putin directly by almost completely invalidating even the notion that Ukraine should exist, that Ukraine should have even a right to exist. Putin himself, in his explicitly anti-communist and anti-Lenin speech that inaugurated this war, he made it very clear that he is of the mind that to the extent that Ukraine exists at all, it is just West Ukraine. The rest of Ukraine is Russian. In other words, the Ukraine that we know in the modern world does not exist, according to Putin and according to some sections of the left. And you see this language playing out over and over and over again. Many who posture as anti-war refuse to acknowledge even the true character of this war.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's an awkwardness here. I'm not going to ally with NATO culture and all of that stuff, but at the same time, again, politics in the lead, ethics, politics, principles. What are they for us? What are we presenting? We are not think tank analysts for either the East or the West. We are advocates of the liberation of the masses of the world, black liberation, working class liberation, liberation of women, etc. So in that framework, and to answer your question, the war on Ukraine, as you've stated somewhat, is a supremacist war. Putin is saying Ukraine does not exist. A whole people, a whole country does not exist. I mean, this is like, okay, here we go, Tel Aviv, we're back there. Thank you very much. I mean, even Western imperialism has never said in its imperialist wars in our lifetime, from the first war against Iraq in 1990, that these countries don't exist. It's never said. It's never argued that. Not in Iraq, not Afghanistan, not in Libya. They say the countries exist. They just want to destroy it and extract everything out of it. So Putin's saying, look, Ukraine doesn't exist. It's all Lenin's fault. It's a crazy bloody experiment that the Bolsheviks did. I'm going to negate that now. And this is an anti-communist operation. So he's arguing that, and then he's conducting a war. So what's going to happen if you conduct a war where you dehumanize the population so much to say they haven't got a right to be a people? What do you think your armed forces are going to do to those people, right? And just as important, perhaps more importantly, what are you depositing into world politics? What ethics or unethics or counter-ethics are you depositing into the world political body? But also, as you've mentioned, these self-professed Marxist, leftist, communist, even Marxist, Leninists, whatever they want to call themselves, they've fallen into this. And because they've fallen into this supremacism, they can't and they haven't actually commented on all the substantial issues in our times and going forward. They can't comment on Brittany Griner, because if they do so, they think they'll be seen to be not part of their camp. So Brittany Griner has overtly been weaponized by Putin in a racist and homophobic way. Right? I mean, they're open about the Russian leadership. They can't comment on Andrew Tate, one of the most notorious, conceited, arrogant, misogynist, racist grifters on the planet, who's currently arrested for rape and people trafficking charges with his brother in Romania. Why can't they comment on Andrew Tate? Because a lot of quote unquote Stalinists, Samira Khan and others online, are actually organizing defense campaigns for Andrew Tate. I mean, it's just, I wish it was parody, but so Samira Khan, very close protege of George Galloway and former presenter on Russia Today, Putin's channel, Dugin's channel, has organized a defense meeting, this is no joke, with the Afghan Taliban in defense of Andrew Tate. None of these red browners on the left have denounced, there's no denunciation of Andrew Tate. Because if they denounce Andrew Tate, they're like, people say, well, hold on a second, Samira Khan's defending Andrew Tate. So the open contradictions, the open just nonsense of this will start to come out. So they lean back from that, they self-censor themselves, and they continue in a very narrow political path. And we have to counter this stuff. It has to be exposed, because the challenges facing our people are just increasingly pressing. I mean, we got climate catastrophe all over the place. We got people in refugee camps in their millions across the world. Where they're looking to come. They're looking to come where it's cooler and where all the looting has been deposited, in London, in Paris, etc. So, we really have to fight this political battle and do it with some principle and some courage, because things are very confusing going forward.
Things are very confusing, I think, because of the awkward place that we've come to politically, where, as you say, the kind of multipolarity, to the extent that it exists, the kind of multipolarity that we have is a multipolarity of imperialisms, is a multipolarity of exploitations of petrocapitalists, whatever, and the issue the issue that I want to at least touch on a little bit is, and to your point, many of these folks that we're talking about, they would never openly say, well, fuck Brittany Griner, right? They would never say that. But instead, what they'll say is, well, what about all of the prisoners in the US? What about all the political prisoners in the US? Well, what about them? The left in the United States that's one of the most active places that the left has been for 35 years. I mean, Mumia Abu-Jamal was a cause célèbre on the left. I mean, the left actually does talk quite a lot about political prisoners. The point that I'm bringing this, the reason why I want to bring this up is because it is a rhetorical tactic that they use to deflect away all of Putin and Russian crimes by simply pointing out the crimes of the West. And the reason I bring that up is because we already know all of those crimes on the left. We know the United States is a gulag state. We know the white supremacist nature of the prison system, the school to prison pipeline, all of the vast implications of how the United States criminalizes dark skin, how the United States uses all of these legal structures that it has imposed to basically create a permanent a permanent underclass within an underclass of convicts and former convicts and so forth. This is all the stuff that we already know and we talk about all the time. But to be unable to speak up for Brittany Griner, who was I would say, multi-level victim, right? She was a victim by virtue of the color of her skin. She was a victim by virtue of her sexual orientation. She was a victim by virtue of just being a woman. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why Griner became this target and symbolic, spoil of war for Putin, and the fact that these people can't speak honestly about it and say what it was and why it happened and just deflect all of that attention away. This is the tactic they use over and over and over again in every context with regard to Putin and Russia's war.
Just before I respond, I just want to big up Court Green here on the chat. He says in 2022 there were more than 44 anti-coup marches in Sudan during the junta regime that Russia and China support, and the junta killed over 122 young people and injured more than 7,000 protesters. Thanks for that, Court Green. Appreciate that comment. Absolutely correct comment. Thank you. Yeah, to answer your point directly, listen, we've been down with Mumia Abu-Jamal since day dot. Robert King, 30-year plus political prisoner from the Black Panther Party, my comrade. Eddie Marshall Conway, 41 years in prison, my comrade. We did the Malcolm X movement event with him in Brixton in 2016 with Minka Ondofo from the Black Unity Freedom Party. Listen, our track record is solid, and it cannot be questioned. Going forward as well, I'm still loyal to all the Black political prisoners all across the world of our struggle. These are we're never going to compromise on these things. I stay loyal, and I will always be loyal. I'm fourth generation in my direct family against British imperialism. My children are the fifth generation. It's never going to stop. But to develop that point, it's just a way to attempt to deflect in an unethical way and in an unprincipled manner. That's all it is. It's rubbish. It's nonsense. It's a bad faith. Calling it bad faith is a gross understatement. It's just an attempt at manipulation and falsehood. I don't care. The track record is there, and the track record continues.
And I just saw that comment from Court Green. Yes, absolutely. The situation in Sudan is actually it's actually much more simple than a lot of these other situations elsewhere. I mean, it is clearly and unmistakably a tiny minority within the military that controls the country against a democratic movement that is made up of poor rural peasants, workers, but also students, middle class, doctors, professionals, taxi drivers, all kinds, all walks of life have been, involved in that movement in Sudan. And were it not for Moscow's aid, Moscow and China, but especially Moscow's aid, that junta would have been toppled long ago.
Totally agree. And just over the Sahara in the Libyan context, it's very important for viewers and listeners to understand this. 2011 Libya NATO operation, NATO war of destruction against a 41-year socialist state, Pan-Africanist, Pan-Arab.
Obscenely criminal war, criminal, almost more nakedly criminal than other NATO wars.
It was an absolute horror story. And the Jamahiriya disproportionately did more for global revolution, funding, supporting liberation movements all over the world, including in England and Ireland. But the point I want to make centrally is this: those people who have decided and made the choice to go into this collaboration with this violent war of supremacism of Putin walked away from the Libyans in 2011. They used the Libyans in 2011, made some articles, went on TV, blah, 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 blah.
Postured as radicals, postured as anti-colonial voices, et cetera, yes.
2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, up to 2020, 21, 22, now 23. I'm still in touch with the Tawargans. I'm still in touch with the Greens. I'm still in touch with people in Sirte, Bani Walid, Tawarga, Seba, Zawara, Benghazi, Dera. I'm still in touch with all of these people. I'm still loyal to them. The people going on being trafficked through the migrant route in Libya. I'm in touch with organizations on the ground in Tripoli. I stay loyal. I stay consistent. All of these other people walked away totally, and ended up. Look where they've ended up.
Use Libya for their own purposes, use Libya to build their credentials, use Libya to build up Twitter followings, use Libya to do whatever it is that they needed to do to better them, to better their careers or social media existence or whatever, and then dump the goddamn issue, completely dumped it. And I mean, I'm not the world's leading expert on Libya, but I've written like a dozen articles in the last 12 years about Libya, what's happened there, what was going on in 2011, what was going on in 2016. How many of them ever even commented on Russia's backing of the former CIA asset Haftar and the moves that were being made in collaboration with the Saudis and the UAE against the Turkish-backed government in Tripoli? I mean, there were dynamics in Libya that had so much more to do with the internal situation in Libya and the regional and international situation than it had to do with just, that 8-month period in 2011. But again, once the spotlight went away, these people they were done.
But the reason they walked away, so I had an exchange with, sorry to mention the name, Margaret Kimberley, who's very much down from the left, even a posturing black radical. Listen, I'm sure Margaret has a lot of good black radical kind of history in her past. I don't know, right? I'd assume so. But Margaret Kimberley, asked her, and she's down with Putin and this red-brown Duganist racket. I said, Wagner, our comrades in Libya, have told me that Wagner have conducted massacres against civilians in Sirte, right? Which is part of the historic African Union initiative by Gaddafi, is part of the Gaddafi tribe and the Watfalla, etc., or part of the former socialist state and the resistance after that. I said, they're telling me Wagner, mercenary group from Putin, are killing our families in Sirte. Can you please denounce this? Do you agree with this or do you oppose this? It's up to Africans if they want Wagner in Africa or not. Who are we? You can't denounce a racist massacre. I mean, what can you say? I mean, expose them, try and engage with them to expose them. They have no leg to stand on. The principles are gone. The ethics are gone. And it's
Wagner
so,
has massacred in Libya. Wagner has massacred in Mali. Wagner has massacred in Mozambique. Wagner has massacred in Sudan. I mean, this is not a one-off situation that happened in Libya. This is Wagner is a neo-Nazi mercenary outfit. These are degenerate thugs, highly armed and highly trained. What do you think they're doing?
but see, look at the manipulation of Putin when in the African context, right? So he does this. He dumps NATO in the he dumps Libya, sorry, in the NATO fire. Opportunistically makes political capital out of it through Russia Today, etc., in order to instrumentalize that in his supremacism going forward, right? But if you look in the African context, that
I'm sorry, Sukhan. I just got to explain something for
please,
people. When you say that Putin dumped Libya, what you mean is that Putin had the opportunity to veto the resolution at the
that's
UN
it.
Security Council.
All we're asking.
Resolution, I think it was 1973, the resolution that authorized use of force, and the resolution that authorized the no-fly zone. Both of those. Putin had an opportunity to stop both of those and chose not to, because for him, it was much more lucrative and much more strategic to stay in bed with the United States and NATO, as he had for 20 years, than it was to oppose them there.
Yeah, absolutely correct. That's all Libyans were asking for. Use your veto. China, Beijing, use your veto. So the Chinese and the Russian, part of the excuse for saying that they didn't use their veto was to say the African Union and the Arab League, the two regional bodies in which Libya was embedded, both supported basically the NATO war against it. So they would have been seen to just override these two regional bodies. However, they like to make political capital out of the NATO war in Serbia, 99, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. You know what's going to happen. What's going to happen when Western imperialism bombs a global South country? It's going to be a debacle. It's going to be a failure in many regards. And people rightly across the world and in Africa and the Arab world will see it as such. So maybe take the risk. If you're principled, there's no principles here. You know, it's self-seeking, narrow nationalism.
And
So
not
like,
only that, it's also capitalism. Russia had very little invested in Libya. There was very little on the line for them, from a financial perspective. As we know, Russia's decision making is done in the interests of an oligarch class and the ruling elites in the Kremlin. And for those groups, there was very little in Libya for them.
but
So
there's one,
they
yeah, there's this one argument that says, and I have to look into this more, that actually Russia had an interest in NATO destroying Libya because of the oil industry, the global oil economy, that Russian
could
gas and
be.
oil
It could also
rallied
be
the markets as a result. I mean, anyway,
that could be reverse engineering some ideas about what they may or may not have done. I don't know. I wouldn't speculate on that. All I know is that I don't believe that Putin didn't believe that defending Libya was in his own interests and in Russia's interests, and so he didn't do it, and he dumped them, just like those elements on the left that align themselves every time with Putin also dumped Libya.
I agree, but I think there's a little point here. So, and people criticize Gaddafi for this, and some Libyans as well. They said, "Oh, he was too arrogant. He should have hugged the Russians closely. Even had a Russian military base or a naval base in Libya." Blah blah blah. I mean, most Libyans don't say that, but some do. But the point is that Gaddafi did advocate for African unity, to be wary of Chinese involvement in Africa and Russian involvement in Africa. Now, Russia and China are not going to like leader of a major state in Africa that's leading the whole continent in many senses of the word, advocating like that. It'd be more convenient just to get rid of him and then just to do, and just to pick up the pieces wherever you can in the fallout within Libya and in the wider region. So I think again,
Which is precisely what happened, by the way. I mean,
yeah,
that is
absolutely.
exactly what happened. The Russians did nothing. They let Gaddafi be assassinated, the country be destroyed, and turned into a civil war, which was the most predictable outcome. And then they, of course, picked their sides in that civil war, backing Haftar and the so-called Libyan National Army, along with Egypt and the UAE and the Saudis. And that's that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, again, it's embarrassing, isn't it, for these red browners in the Putin camp, because what they're going to say about Libya and Putin, oh, he backed longtime CIA asset Haftar with UAE,
Yeah.
oh, hooray, that's something to promote. Oh, maybe it's not,
And it's not to say, it's not to say that the Turks were like the greatest benevolent actors either. They have their own interests backing a Muslim Brotherhood formation in Tripoli, etc. Right? So everything got complicated in Libya, and I think the overriding point here is that you have to do the work of analysis along the lines of one's political ideas and principles to be able to understand what was happening in Libya. But these sections of the left, they never cared. That was the point. They never cared.
Well, listen, we were a little bit part of this as well, weren't we? From
100%. That's
yes,
absolutely.
Into around circa 2016, you get dragged into only talking about Russian subjective framing of Eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, Donbass. You get dragged into, just basically trying to positively spin this whole load of rubbish and trash, and you get paid for that. You get the narcissism.
Of course, ego stroking, the clicks, the followers, the money, all of that stuff.
Yeah, and once you become, obviously, people have, families to look after. Once you get a certain level of income in a certain political setup, it's, it requires a certain kind of human being to say, you know what, this has just turned really ugly. I want no part to play in any of this stuff. I'm going to walk away. Or, you know what, it's turned really ugly. I'm going to walk away and counter it publicly, right?
Yes.
Some people just go quiet. And, I don't sympathize, but I understand, okay, it's too much to handle emotionally, psychologically. I'm out, okay? All right. I prefer that than continuing with the trash, continuing with the manipulation, arguably. But then there's been a little group of us, you can count them probably in one hand, at stretch.
two fingers.
Who said, nah, I'm out of this. And you know what? Weaponizing and demonizing the entire migrant flow into Europe, I might not be down with that. Saying all migrant communities in the West shouldn't be here. Ooh, bit of neo-Nazism there. I'm not too keen, with that anymore. Maybe I should raise my voice and say, hey, that's not very nice. We defend migrants. We defend racialized workers, etc. It's a sad state of affairs. What can you say? But money talks, and fascist money talks. Very much so.
What role do you think Syria played in creating and/or exacerbating the divisions that we're talking about on the left and within anti-imperialism? I mean, in hindsight, I think that Syria, and especially Russia's direct intervention in Syria, I think it is very informative to understanding a lot of the conflicts that exist now on the left. So that's a very general entry point onto this issue. So let me just ask you in the most general way, how did Syria and the left's debates over Syria influence, affect, and sort of chart the course for some on the left today?
It's a really interesting question. I do feel a bit sorry. I don't support them, but I do feel sorry a little bit for the Syrian government and state. They've got no option but to just make out they agree everything what the Russians are doing, And actually, there's been a few Syrian nationalists. Again, I don't particularly support them politically, or look, this is not in our interest. So what I mean by saying all of this is to say the way Russia has positioned Syria in this very precarious junior relationship to it as a master means that the Syrians who really want to try and defend their country, they just can't wiggle out of this. They're kind of stuck in this vice of Russian control. But to answer your point, I think several things are going on with the Syria war. First of all, Russia adopts a US British approach to the war on terror and imposes that on Syria. So what the USA and Britain did to Iraq and Afghanistan, and also Libya, the Russians imposed onto Syria. You have this evil, monstrous Islamic people that need to be obliterated and destroyed without mercy, without sympathy, without human concern, right? Barrel bombs, bombing, just bombing civilians and all of this stuff, right? So you have a promotion and then an internalization on parts of the Putin-aligned left to say that's good. And maybe I played into that in some part, which I make myself critique and apologies around. So there's that. Secondarily, and in direct relation to that, which political forces in the West do you think are going to like and identify and align with a big military state coming into a majority Muslim Arab country and massacring naughty Muslims? Who's going to like that in the West? The far right. So Nick Griffin, the leader of the British National Party, the most significant neo-Nazi leader here in the last 40 years, goes to Syria, goes to Lebanese Hezbollah, right? David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the KKK, close friend of the Syrian government, and especially the government in Iran. Look at the state of the resistance axis in this regard. Iran replaces its best friend David Duke with another bunch of neo-Nazis, Putin and Dugin. I mean, like, come on, the inferiority complex is nothing new in Iran. You can go back to the 30s and Hitler. I mean, it's a big problem throughout the global south, and very much so because of the whole Persian Empire feeds into this Aryanism. Iran, actually, the word Iran comes from Aryan as well. And there's a very interesting history there. So you got the internalization of the war on terror, racism, etc. You got alignment directly, indirectly with the Western far right. And then it comes full circle that look at the politics that Russia and China espouses, very similar to right-wing politics in the West, So that's the influences had, and no one raises their voice about this apart from, yours truly in this debate. That's it. I mean, it is what it is, to use a modern proverb.
Now, I think it's important to point out for people, and I understand that a lot of people don't follow these things that closely and are looking for, to find a little 15-minute window in their day where they can watch a video and learn as much as possible about what might be happening. So I'm constantly trying to retrace the steps that got us here to understanding how we got to this point. And I think one of the issues that we really do need to raise is not only the issue of Syria, but also, as you noted, the issue of Russia essentially mimicking Western framework in every way. One of which was, as you noted, in Syria, the Western framework of the war on terror. That is directly out of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and the war on terror of the Bush administration, right? And then you see, yeah, well, actually, yes, and the Chechen War as well. It's an echo of both of those things. And simultaneously, if you look at the war on Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and this is, I published this in Counterpunch 2 weeks after the invasion, it follows directly the neoconservative playbook. Directly. Just point by point, Russia's case for war on Ukraine was point by point the U.S. case for the war in Iraq. Yeah. If it was substitute Al-Qaeda terrorists with Azov battalion Nazis, substitute weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons with Ukrainian biolabs and the Ukrainian nuclear program, which doesn't exist, by the way. If you go down the line of all of these justifications that Putin has made, they're right out of the Bush and Cheney playbook. And so what you find is this very, very odd or humiliating or embarrassing or whatever you want to say, collaboration wherein elements on the left have essentially internalized neoconservative politics and neoconservative thinking in their supposed battle against liberals and neoliberals. Isn't it amazing that people that stood shoulder to shoulder with you opposing the war in Iraq are now quite literally cheerleading the war on Ukraine that is almost, in many ways, identical?
2 points. People have to understand the construction of the post-Soviet Russian state was very much a Western imperialist kind of managed creation, including Yeltsin and then into the Putin leadership. I mean, come on, let's not be silly about this stuff. We have to be honest. I mean, why did it come about? I mean, listen, those communists that were vanquished, who were aligned to Soviet Moscow, were obviously just, their world fell apart in the 90s and they were looking for a savior. Putin postured it as such, manipulated the Soviet nostalgia, and hey presto, you've got a whole global industry that's promoting Putin as this kind of Soviet nostalgic kind of savior. So one of my, I'm going to mention him, Keith Bennett, is an old comrade, even a mentoring comrade of mine for a good part of nearly 3 decades. He said to me that, you know, the Russian state is a continuation of the Soviet state in the military field, but not in the political field, right? It's a kind of a way to justify Russian kind of narrow nationalist, chauvinist kind of military and political outreach. It's not acceptable. So people have to understand that this is a construction of the leading NATO countries. That NATO cannot, Western imperialism, because of the nature of it, because it seeks domination and monopolization, cannot accept Russia into its club, has to be understood for what it is, right? But still, the West will play that game with Putin. Oh, we're friends, we're friends. Putin's like, can I come into your club then? They're like, no, sorry, okay? Putin and Bush danced together in Sochi in the early 2000s, you know, the sleazy dancing with young women, kind of trash, but that's their whole culture of corruption and sleaze at the top. But then the role China plays into this. Russia is a very indefensible state. It's a state difficult to defend from the left. Now, the red browners on the right can say, look, Russia culturally is defending itself against the woke liberalism, and you know, you can't
the transgendered Western
we
left.
don't want all our men transgendered into women, and gays can't do any smoochy on the street. You'll go to jail.
Yes.
Right, okay, fine, right. The left can't really defend that. But then China comes into this whole political culture, and then China distorts its own self-image, the Chinese leadership, as socialist, right? It's very interesting, the way that they kind of instrumentalize that and the role that plays also on the leftist spectrum of the red-brown, of the fascist collaboration racket. You can't defend Russia as a society, but you can attempt to defend China as some kind of functioning, healthy, victory upon victory, year upon year socialist construction. Well, Beijing leadership is more embedded with global finance capital in the West than it is with any laboring people in the world or defending global South states. You know, the Beijing leadership, we're all their sons and daughters, living in Mayfair, living up in Mayfair, in Kensington, the equivalents in Paris and New York, the top universities. They are down 100% with a Western white man in Wall Street and the city of London. You know, then they use this kind of socialist thing to control their population, to be paternalistic, right? That's all kind of falling apart now with the protests against zero COVID across social classes in China. And now even in Henan, people are rioting against police because the police don't want them to set off fireworks. You have people toppling police cars, trashing them, and about 1,000 people jubilating or filming it enthusiastically on their mobile phone. The image that Xi Jinping and the Beijing leadership is trying to promote in the world, that somehow everything's under control, everyone loves me, everything is stable going forward. No, there is a crisis developing across all the populations in the world. And actually, you know, I was thinking about this today, Eric. The Chinese people cannot be controlled, actually. The Chinese people are very rebellious people. And even, I think there has been relatively, if you take, for example, relative to India, Chinese people are doing much better. The Chinese leadership do want to build up a state in the way they do. But that doesn't mean the Chinese people are going to stop being rebellious. They want more and they're going to get more, and they're not going to stand for being forced to stay in their Foxconn factory by the Beijing leadership in a COVID outbreak so they can ensure contributing iPhone for the world market. You know, Chinese people are not going to have this. They jumped out the perimeter fence. And I think that was very metaphorical of what's happening in China. So China plays a really deeply problematic role in all of this as well.
We're going to come to the end of our conversation here pretty soon, but before we do, let's get awkward, Sukant. Let's talk about awkwardness and awkward political positions, because Ukraine, in my view, thrusts the left whatever segment of the left you are, into an awkward position. And the question for me is who recognizes it and who doesn't, right? So I recognize the awkwardness of the position of defending Ukraine while simultaneously not wanting to advocate for NATO's weapons, right? That is an awkward position to be because you recognize and acknowledge, as you have for years and years and years, that NATO is a monster, an absolutely monstrous entity that represents US imperialism, that is a cancer on the planet. And simultaneously, as you recognize that, you then have to ask yourself, is advocating for NATO's military support to a country like Ukraine, is this a decent position to take? Is this an anti-imperialist position? And that's where the awkwardness comes in, because it depends on how one views a situation. So the on the one side, the idea of NATO weapons going to Ukraine. On the other side, the idea of what else would Ukraine do when it's been invaded by the Russians? Who else would Ukraine go to? Where else would they get weapons? So then you ask yourself, well, if you live in the real world, not in the fantasy world where negotiations versus arming is like, a metaphysical concept. In the real world, there are only two options. Either Ukraine gets weapons from NATO or Russia steamrolls Ukraine, right? Those are the only two options. And so the question is, can one acknowledge the awkwardness of that position while at the same time holding true to your principles, as you've been saying throughout this conversation? For me, the very basic principle remains the same in Ukraine as it always has been. And that is that a people that have been invaded, that are being oppressed, that have been colonized, those people have a right to resist in every form imaginable. And that includes supporting Iraqis when they were killing US soldiers, supporting Afghans killing US occupiers, supporting Palestinians killing Israeli occupiers. This principle, in my view, holds true in every context. And so for me, the same principle in Ukraine. Ukraine has been invaded. Ukraine is historically subordinate to the colonial power next door. Ukraine has been invaded once again, and Ukraine has a right to defend itself, the right to self-determination, as Lenin, as you noted, Lenin said repeatedly. There is no self-determination if your historic colonial overlord is steamrolling your country.
Yes, it is awkward, but we're in the business of curating and constructing and developing our politics and our political project, which is not the same as Kiev NATO, right? There's some principles of overlap which are very awkward. I agree with you, but the thing is, Kiev and NATO, they have their relationship. That's just an objective thing. I don't need to say anything about that, it particularly. So like to go back again, it's like, is everything okay on the live?
Yeah.
Sorry. And so for us, it's to construct what our politics are. So it's just to espouse our principles and apply it to the Ukrainian context. Now, I have said once or twice on social media that what would you do if you're sitting with your family and children in your flat and your council estate in Kiev or wherever in Ukraine is being bombed by the Russians, and they're knocking out your electricity and they're knocking out your gas. You're sitting in the cold and the dark with your children. How would you feel? What would you do? It's a question I asked, and I got attacked by someone saying, "Oh, see, he's pro-NATO." Oh no, really? You really can't, go through that process of trying to understand and empathize and then apply it to your political principles. I shared another video. Ukrainian forces shot down a Russian cruise missile in the air. And I shared it with a friend. And, I'm not saying the friend is supportive of Russia necessarily. I don't think so. But I shared it with a friend. I said, look at this video. Do you want that cruise missile to land, or do you want it blown up in the sky? Because where it's going to land, it might land most likely in a residential area or hit civilian infrastructure. I don't want that missile to land. I want that missile to be either blown up or ideally not to be shot in the first place. That's the principles, isn't it? We have to be consistent. We oppose occupation. And one of my first posts on social media, on Facebook actually, just after the outset of the war in Ukraine, was this. I will never compromise opposing colonial occupation. I'll never compromise on that. I've stood with that with the Palestinians all my life. Even as a child, my parents sympathized with Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian cause of Palestinian liberation. When I became a young adult, I supported it through my teens, and now I'm 44. It's something that I will never compromise on, and I stay true to that and apply it to the Ukraine context as well. People have a right to defend their families and their communities against a colonial supremacist war of occupation and annexation. When was the last time a major state annexed countries? Come on, Hitler, Nazi Germany. That was the only last time I can think in history where this Lebensraum concept of annexation is now being replayed. I think Putin has watched too many documentaries about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I think he's seen too many documentaries about the siege of Stalingrad and Leningrad. And the funny thing is, I think he's seen too many documentaries about the Bolshevik slogan of land, peace, and bread to stop the First World War. He's like replaying so much of this, internalizing and then projecting it out onto Ukrainians and Ukraine. It's just very strange to see all of this,
He internalizes all of the wrong lessons.
All of the, all from the opposite side. Like, no. It's so by the way, the Molotov-Ribbentrop period is very important to also in this context to go back to, because if you read Molotov Remembers, Molotov was the most loyal leader next to Stalin. In his memoirs, he talks about like how politically, culturally the Nazis and the Soviet leadership actually fused through that. And it wasn't just a tactical thing. It was a deeply political, cultural kind of alliance as well. There you go. Pulled it out. Well done, bruv.
There you go. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I agree with you. This is a great book for people if you can get a copy of that one. Here, let me see.
And Molotov is the most loyal Bolshevik to Stalin than any other, right? So, read that book. Go back to those chapters. Brilliant book. So yeah, so this is where we're at. People need to go and study and reflect. But I think there's a lot of people who are not in the Putin camp, with the left or the right and the whole red-brown spectrum. People are watching. People are listening. People are shifting. And to be honest, we know that these red-browners on the left, they just said nothing from the outset, really.
And they claim to be on the left, and many of them claim to be communists. Well, maybe they should, since I'm pulling books, maybe they should consider reading that one.
No, he's the problem. That's the problem.
Maybe this gentleman right here wrote a book, or actually a collection of his writings that touch on all of the issues that are relevant today, and specifically touching on Ukraine. Lenin's The Right of Nations to Self-Determination is absolutely required reading if you're going to understand anything about what's happening in the war in Ukraine now, if you're going to understand Putin's thinking, the way that the Russian far right thinks, what Russian chauvinism means. Lenin's writings are full of references to great Russian chauvinism. Great Russian chauvinism he saw as one of the true enemies of the working class in Russia, and one of the true enemies of the working class throughout the Russian Empire, and really throughout the entire world. In many ways, and I'm not trying to be like, the hype man for Lenin, unless if he needs one, but Lenin really was a visionary when it came to these issues, and that's precisely the reason why Stalin, when he ultimately consolidated power, reversed everything that Lenin tried to do.
Bro, what are you trying to say? Mass population transfer of oppressed minorities in the Soviet Union is not great Soviet socialism? Come on.
Yeah, now. Exactly. Right. We'll look up the Crimean Tatars and find out what happened to them.
The Chechens as well. The Soviet Koreans as well. The Volga Germans as well.
Absolutely. So in any event, I think that those are a couple of books that are worth reading, among many others. Sukant, thanks for chatting with me today. We're out of time. If people like this, if people want this sort of live stream discussion more, I'm happy to do that. You can comment if you're watching on Facebook, on YouTube, wherever that might be. Send me a note. Follow Sukant and Sukant's work. Follow him on Twitter. That's the Malcolm X movement. What is it? At MXMVNT?
At MX Movement.
At MX Movement on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at Stop Imperialism. You can follow me on
Instagram.
Facebook. Instagram. Get Malcolm X Movement on Instagram. And I guess look for more videos like this. Sukant Chandan, thanks so much for chatting today.
Pick it up. Nice one.
Viewers, thanks again. Talk to you soon.